Okay, let's talk about Shushan Airport, which of course is now New Orleans Lakefront Airport. NEW, the three-digit abbreviation call for Lakefront Airport. I am, of course, Edward Branley, your NOLA history guy, at NOLA history guy on all the social medias and all of that kind of stuff. Now, Shushan Airport, we'll talk about its origins, how it came about, and its construction. Its namesake, Abe Shushan, and we'll talk about his rise and fall in the 1920s and 1930s. We'll discuss the opening of the airport and its early years in the 1930s, its role during World War II, a little bit about post war, and a quick note on the modern Lakefront Airport, which, uh, frankly, we're at a point with the history of Lakefront Airport that we'll end up doing another podcast just on the modern side of Lakefront Airport at some point in the future. That's our logo there of New Orleans Lakefront Airport, NEW. So the origins, this goes back to the Milneberg lease of the entire lakefront. And then, of course, the industrial canal plays a bit of a role in the airport's development as well. Alexander Milne and the lakefront. Now, Milne was a Scotsman who lived in the basically the late 18th century, and he lived in New Orleans, and he pitched a concept of development to the Spanish government at the time. Now, remember, uh, New Orleans was owned, quote unquote, was administered by the Spanish. The treaty was signed in 762. The Spanish took over in 1768. By the 1780s and 1790s, Milne is making a pitch and he says, I want to develop parts of the Lake Pontchartrain, of the northern part of the city of New Orleans along Lake Pontchartrain. How about you get the crown, and that's the Spanish crown, to lease it to me? And the Spanish were kind of like, hey, sure, that sounds like a great idea. So basically, with the exception of reserving the area around the mouth of the bayou for Fort St. John, which had this map from basically 100 years later in the 1890s, still labeled there as Spanish Fort. But what happens is that Milne starts developing the idea of access to the lake in the 1790s and continues this, and his investors do so as well, to the point where by the flip now, the Americans, we get the whole thing with the Spanish owning Louisiana, giving it back to Bonaparte. So we become French for about, 30 days. And then he flips it to Jefferson, and we become part of the United States in 1803. None of that really stops business. It's all business as usual, and mostly in French in New Orleans. And part of that is the development of the lakefront. Milne starts developing out what becomes Port Pontchartrain later. And so by the 1830s, instead of the bayou connecting to the Carondelet Canal, which that's the old Basin Canal, then further out you've got the New Basin Canal. There was talk of building a canal out from Faubourg Marigny, basically along Elysian Fields, what is now Elysian Fields Avenue, but that didn't pan out. And in 1829, 1830, that's when the Pontchartrain Railroad gets built. So Milne's Port Pontchartrain is then serviced by a railroad. So that made it easier. You didn't have to worry about bringing about the size of craft, that they didn't have to fit down the bayou or to go down the new canal. You could bring in larger craft, dock them at Port Pontchartrain in Milneberg, and put all the stuff on the train and bring it down to Faubourg Marigny to there at Elysian Fields in the river. So that's kind of how this all starts developing at this point. Uh, you've got Milneburg develops out as Port Pontchartrain. The area around Fort St. John develops out as well. And then when the new canal is constructed and open for business in the 1840s, that's off frame to the left. That becomes the other big area that's developed. And of course, a lot of these end up becoming more entertainment than commerce over time. But initially, that's the idea, is that Milne leases the area and that starts commercial development in what well becomes Milneburg and Gentilly. And that's the basis for why the airport kind of sort of ends up over on that side. The other big addition after the Pontchartrain Railroad is the concept of still the desire to have a canal that directly connects Lake Pontchartrain to the river. Now, remember, the two big canals through basically the well, Bayou St. John, then fizzling out. Actually, it fizzles out where it fizzles out now, which is right there off of Norman C. Francis Parkway, not far from Parkway Bakery, if you're familiar with that place. And of course, that was the convergence of Bayou Metairie and Bayou St. John. It was a whole bunch of swamp. So the Spanish built a canal from just outside the French Quarter north to that point to connect the bayou to the Carondelet Canal. But it's basically that was designed to bypass the Great Portage, so you didn't have to pick up your canoes and walk back to the city. Now you could get all the way to just outside Rampart Street, but you couldn't get to the river. Canal Street was going to have a canal that never worked out. The new canal was a competitor. Basically, the Anglo-Irish, the Americans, wanted control of their own waterway, but it was the same deal basically as the Carondelet Canal, that it only went to South Rampart Street. It still wasn't the connection direct to the river. It's connection to the city, but not to the river. So if you had like ocean-going vessels or vessels that were coming up the mouth from the mouth of the river, they had to stop because coming up the canals did them no good. So the idea of a canal completely connecting everything had been proposed for a long time. We go a little bit further out, basically past Elysian Fields, past Franklin, and we come out to some swampy land there in Gentilly. And the idea of digging a canal is authorized in 1914. Construction actually begins in 1918. It takes a while to build this. It's deep. It's designed to handle it can handle container freight and modern ocean-going ships. So it needed to be big. Plus, we needed locks to balance out the river with this waterway. So the canal operations don't begin until 1923. With the canal there was a need for the Southern Railway. New Orleans was actually New Orleans Terminal Company and New Orleans Northeastern Railroad, which then gets acquired by the Southern Railway system. They needed to build a bridge across the new canal. So the canal operations begin in 1923, and the railroad builds a bridge there in Seabrook, right there at the mouth of the canal, the connector of the canal to Lake Pontchartrain. That bridge opens up not long after the canal begins operations in the 1920s. So, of course, now we've got all of this development. We've got the industrial canal over there. You've got the Pontchartrain Railroad, which by the 1920s, Port Pontchartrain is less influential as a commercial development. It's more of a day tripping kind of thing, with there's a hotel and restaurants and some entertainment stuff out there. So the train is really just bringing kind of day trippers and weekenders and that kind of thing out to Milneburg at this point. It's really this little small resort area, plus a whole bunch of fishing camps and that kind of thing. Enter Abe Shushan, who is a member of a Jewish retail family who have a good bit of uh, influence in the city. Now, Abe himself isn't really interested in the retail and the commercial side of the family. He goes off and gets involved in a lot more public activities, and he gets involved in Huey Long's political organization. So he puts together a whole bunch of things and starts working with the Long people. They reward his service by making him the president of the Orleans Levee Board in the 20s. And Shushan proposes this big improvement plan for the lakefront in 1922. The idea is that's where the Lake Pontchartrain seawall in Orleans Parish comes from. They put together a package. It's going to be $15 million worth of development, 4 million of which is earmarked to build an airport not far from the Industrial Canal. Huey Long, as governor, the legislature passes this. Huey signs off on everything. So naturally, the legislature approves it. He signs it. There's some legal delays that push the project back to 1931, but the project does get moving. This is all in the days of land reclamation and levee board projects that were supervised by Shushan. Here's an idea of what land reclamation looked like out at the West End. This is a levee board photo from 1923 of basically the mess that was the lakefront as you're trying to build up the seawall and then drain things, drain the area behind it, and that becomes what we now call the levee board subdivisions, which was West and East Lakeshore, Lake Vista, Lake Terrace, and then Lake Oaks. Seawall construction begins with the approval of this package in 1931. You can see the idea here is basically the seawall is being built, and it basically essentially becomes a dam. So you dam off the lake on the north side, on the left-hand side of this photo, and behind that, well, you still got water because you've dammed off a section of the lake, but that becomes the reclamation part. You pump that water back out over the nascent seawall here, drain it out, and that becomes the reclaimed land that is where Lakeshore Drive and the green space and then the subdivisions, the residential area is then built out. So all this begins in 1931. The green space and such comes along, and Lakeshore Drive is then paved out in the late 1930s as part of Depression era stimulus programs like the Works Project Progress Administration. By the time it's all completed, here is Abraham Lazard Shushan Sr., Abe Shushan, standing in front of a monument, a stone monument documenting the completion of the Lake Pontchartrain seawall in 1933. Abe himself was born in 1894 in Reserve, Louisiana. The family works their way into the New Orleans business community. Shushan Brothers is a dry goods company owned by his father and his uncle. He doesn't go into the Shushan Toys, by the way. If you're a longtime New Orleanian, you may remember Shushan Toy Store because that was the big retail. A lot of what the Shushan Brothers did was wholesale and dry goods, but that toy store and that toy business was their big retail claim to fame. Abe didn't really want to work in the retail side of the family business, so he attaches himself to the Huey Long organization, which was not that was the politics of Long and anti-Long go all the way into Orleans Parish and run deep, and he becomes a longtime supporter of Huey Long, so that when flood protection and development of the lakefront becomes a thing for the state, the Orleans Parish Levee District is created, and that has of course, a management board to operate it, and the Orleans Parish Levee Board becomes that operation. So that's the idea. That's what we see. That's what we see here for that. Abe becomes president of the levee board. He starts pitching his development projects then starts pitching the development project in 1922. And so by the 1930s, here we are with him posing proud of his success. Shushan has some highs and lows. From the highs of being an influential member of the Long organization in the 1920s and his success pushing everything forward, it turned sour for him. You know, the land reclamation stuff is successful. The seawall and the airport are incredible successes. He's accused of voter fraud when he actually runs for political office in 1932, but those accusations don't get any legs. He's of course incredibly popular, and he is part of the Long organization, and the airport that he builds is named for him and is opened as Shushan Airport in January of 1934. By 1935, though, the feds start coming for him. This is partly because, in general, Roosevelt is coming for a lot of the Long organization with support from anti-Long factions in the state, particularly in Orleans Parish. They turn their attention to Shushan. He is indicted and tried on tax evasion and money laundering charges in 1935. Now he's acquitted, but all of the stuff that comes up in court tarnishes his reputation severely. And to the point where Shushan Airport is renamed. I mean, it's only opened in 1934 and it's being renamed in 1935. The feds take another run at Abe, and he's convicted of wire fraud in 1939. Here's a photo of Shushan around town in 1941. So, with after about a year of operation, you can see the main entrance to the airport terminal there with its beautiful Art Deco structure and artwork is open to Shushan Airport. Later, the Shushan gets knocked down and it just becomes New Orleans Lakefront Airport. You see, they just simplify the sign in modern times. So the airport opens in 1934. Here's an architectural rendering of the terminal building. Now, this is the rear. That front picture was the entrance in the parking area. This was the rear entrance where basically you can see what were airport gates, if you will, just kind of simple access. Planes would pull up to the back of the terminal. You would walk out, no TSA back in the day, that kind of thing, no jetways, anything like that. You just kind of walked out because it was general aviation and then nascent commercial aviation. And, well, of course, military operations took place in the hangars off to the side. Immediately now, of course, New Orleans has a quote real airport instead of just landing on airstrips and pastures and that kind of thing. So one of the things that we see is some of the aircraft airshow barnstorming type events come to New Orleans. Now the airport opens in January of 1934, and there's already a big air show. The Pan American Air Races come to New Orleans in February, tying in with Carnival at that time for a big air show, which promotes the airport and touts its success. The first big service facility. So what we've seen so far is the terminal and the people side of the airport. The aircraft service facility that's first constructed is Moffett Hangar, which is off. If you stand in front of the airport, it would be you're looking at the terminal, walking into that main doorway. Moffett Hangar would be to the left there. It's still a general aviation support facility out there. And it was opened in 1934. And as a matter of fact, a big dedication banquet was held inside the hangar for all of the movers and shakers invited in by Shushan and the governor to celebrate the opening and mark the opening of the airport. Here's a postcard, a Kirk-type postcard from 1935, typical of postcards from this period. You can see basically what happened is somebody went up in a plane, took a photograph of the airport looking down. That would naturally be a black and white photograph. You send the film back off to the publishing company. They develop the film. They send prints back to somebody who can then color it in, send it to a local artist who then colors in everything, and then you can sell that in bookshops, tobacco shops, hotels, etc., as a postcard. Hangar number 5 becomes an expansion of the airport's second big facility, and again, these hangars, Moffett becomes a where actually becomes initially a military facility in the 30s. Hangar number 5 becomes general aviation and support. The military operations at Lakefront Airport start not long after the airport begins operation in the mid late 1930s. It's staffed up by the 122nd Observation Squadron. And the 122nd actually had its base on west side of the west side of the industrial canal. Used to be referred to as Bomber Base, and there was even a Nazi bus line that took you out from down Franklin Avenue to Bomber Base and brought you up to the 122nd, as well as a lot of the other facilities that become part of the war effort in that area. So on the west side of the industrial canal, on that area, which was called an Army cantonment at the time, just listed on maps as such, just an Army facility without a name. And then the 122nd Observation had its barracks, offices, and support buildings on that west side of the industrial canal, and it used Shushan Airport on the eastern side of the industrial canal. That was its airfield. We say it's Shushan Airport, but at this point, by the mid 1930s, Abe Shushan has fallen out of favor. The airport is renamed. You can still see. That's why we got to do. We'll do another pod on Lakefront Airport. There's still all kind of AS monogram stuff, like on doorknobs and on walls and stuff, where it's like Abe was not one to lack for self promotion, right? So it's like all kind of stuff with his initials still all over it to this day. But it becomes Lakefront Airport, which gets the 3-letter FAA designation of NEW for New Orleans. The FAA being as conservative as they are, when the big airport in Kenner is built, which is now, of course, Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport, the government is hesitant to rename an airport because you've got maps and transponders and everything, radio frequencies all pointing NEW at the lakefront. So that's why the big airport becomes MSY, or it was Moisant Airfield. Moisant Stockyards is what the MSY stood for. And that's why our big airport is MSY to this day, and Lakefront is still NEW. So offices, support, barracks on the west side of the industrial canal, the airfield on the eastern side. The land that's out there, in addition to the 122nd Army Air Corps base, becomes a supply base named for a Medal of Honor winner, Leroy Johnson. So it becomes Camp Leroy Johnson, which becomes a Cold War supply base. The idea was that New Orleans, being a big port, if we ever had to go back to Europe and resupply a Cold War fight against the Soviet Union, then Camp Leroy Johnson would stage supplies and stuff coming in off of the railroad. That would get brought down to the riverfront, staged on ships, and brought over to Europe at that point. By 1964, that dynamic had completely changed. The Army gives up on Camp Leroy Johnson and closes it. Now, Louisiana, the Navy had long given up on the lakefront and moved Naval Air Station New Orleans from west of Pontchartrain Beach down across the river to Belchase, Louisiana, because they wanted to fly jets, and naturally the neighbors weren't exactly too keen on that. So the Navy base closes. That becomes Louisiana State University in New Orleans, which is now UNO, University of New Orleans. And in 1964, the Army closes down Camp Leroy Johnson. The land reverts back to the state. The state turns over that area off of Franklin Avenue to Louisiana State University and to LSUNO. And now it is the University of New Orleans East Campus, and that's where the UNO Lakefront Arena is. The 122nd Observation Squadron flew the North American O-47 observation bomber. It's basically a scout plane that was capable of mounting bombs on the bottom, and you can see the big observation gun sight there for a dive bomber on the plane. So the idea was that the 122nd was an observation, a scout and attack coastal defense force that could look for German U-boats. It could look for unauthorized shipping coming into the Gulf of Mexico. The coastal defense forts that defended New Orleans going back to the Spanish colonial period were certainly no longer useful in modern aviation in the modern aviation period. So naturally, we see the need for observation and defense in southern Louisiana. That becomes the 122nd. The planes again are based at the airport, and the staff and all of its buildings were on the other side at Bomber Base. Here's a little map to give you a feel for some of this. You can see the on the left there where it says air and that little ON, that's Naval Air Station. That is now the UNO campus, or was NAS New Orleans. So that road there is Elysian Fields, and that is where Pontchartrain Beach is, in that little split area for Lakeshore Drive. Camp Pontchartrain is now the Lake Oak subdivision, and then that narrow rectangular block is the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Factory. That area that says cantonment area eventually becomes Camp Leroy Johnson. So Consolidated Vultee is on one side of Franklin Avenue, and Bomber Base is on the other side of Franklin Avenue. Here's a photo of Bomber Base down there at the bottom of the photo, and you saw that ovally area on the map, and that's what that is down there at the bottom, with the 122nd's support buildings and such there at the bottom. The cantonment area was a whole bunch of barracks and support buildings and general support that later gets converted into Camp Leroy Johnson. Right above that, you see a little sparser group of 6 or 8 buildings that actually was a POW stockade for German Luftwaffe prisoners who were engineers and aeronautical engineers, in particular, aircraft mechanics and that kind of thing, who then gave their parole. They were sent to New Orleans, and they worked at the Consolidated Vultee plant, which built the PBY Catalinas that were used in World War II. Behind that, you can see what the empty area that becomes the Lake Oak subdivision, the Pontchartrain Beach, and then the Naval Air Station in the background from there. So Bomber Base was here on the west side of the Industrial Canal, and the airfield was at New Orleans Lakefront Airport, at Shushan Airport. You got from one to the other by hopping into a car or hopping into a Jeep, and you went across the Seabrook Railroad Bridge, which was constructed by the Southern Railway System right after the completion of the Industrial Canal. This is the west side of the canal, looking from, leaving Bomber Base and coming up onto the Industrial Canal. You'd cross the railroad bridge. The railroad bridge was a bascule drawbridge and it actually had a automobile section on the bridge on either side, so you could go across east, in this case, west to east, and then back to get to the airport. Here's the bridge today. The automobile lanes have been removed from the bridge, and it's strictly a railroad bridge. That's because you can see the big overpass there. That's the modern Seabrook Bridge, which which crosses over the Industrial Canal, so that you don't basically. Very rarely do you need to open the drawbridge for it to be a really large vessel that would be going in or out of the lake from the Industrial Canal. That would require you to raise the Seabrook Bridge. Usually, the Bascule Bridge here, well, it still stays down because Norfolk Southern traffic. You can see that's a Norfolk Southern train from this photo is like from 2018 or 2019. Uh, uh, 2018, I believe, and both Amtrak and Norfolk Southern, well, actually, all the railroads use it if they're looking to get up across, go up to the 5 Mile Bridge, cross Lake Pontchartrain, and points north. Remember that architectural rendering of Shushan Airport? Here's a shot now from the late 1930s of that. That's the completed building. You can see that there's the purpose of this photo shot in 1938, 1939 or so. The Progress Administration is now building out a number of improvements, such as hangar number 5 and other improvements. That's a Douglas C-47. That could be a DC-3, the commercial version of the C-47 in this photo here. So again, this is the rear side of the terminal. You pulled up and parked on the other side of the building, walk through the building if you had business or whatever, and walk out, and then your plane would be ready for takeoff on the on this side, on the lake side of the building. In 1939 and 1940, the 122nd are reassigned from New Orleans and sent over to the United Kingdom. They become part of the war effort as a training squadron for the Royal Air Force, and kind of a first look type Army Air Corps unit moving over to England at that point. We're not at war yet, but Lend-Lease and aircraft equipment is coming over. So they bring the 122nd over for training and support. And then Moffett Hangar, as you can see, is empty. Eventually, this gets turned over to the Louisiana Air National Guard, who operate a number of aircraft, most notably Black Hawk helicopters and such, out of the facility to this day. So in post-World War II time, the 122nd comes back from Britain after World War II, but they come back as a bombardment. Those O-47s were long, ineffective and such. The 122nd transition to being a B-26 bomber squadron, flying B-26 Invaders. So after the war, that unit returns to Bomber Base, returns to Lakefront Airport. The modernization of the 122nd continues. The B-26s are dropped, and the squadron goes back to its coastal defense role, flying F-80 U.S. Air Force F-86 interceptors, and it goes back to that whole idea of patrolling the Louisiana, Mississippi Gulf Coast, basically in 1950s jets. The unit still exists, and it's now it's still at Belchase. Had moved down when the Naval Air Station moves down there. It's referred to, the base is referred to now as JRB New Orleans, Joint Reserve Base New Orleans, because there's a number of units. There's Air Force, Marine Corps, and naval units down there. So the military presence at Lakefront Airport is the Louisiana Air National Guard, and it's mostly helicopters and helicopter support stuff there. Here's a shot now. You remember that postcard of an aerial view of the airport, and you can kind of see the older runway, but it's now been expanded out extensively in the 1950s and then further expanded into the lake in the 60s and 70s. There was talk at one point when Southwest Airlines was expanding, they had gotten their legal clearances and political clearances so they could go out beyond Texas pretty much in terms of home airports and such. They were more than willing, more than interested in coming to New Orleans. And of course, Southwest always operated as low cost as they possibly could. So they took a serious look at moving to NEW here. But of course, by now, the modern Gentilly, just no way, right? There's no way you were going to have 737s taking off and landing. The airport can support 737s, can support 707, 737s, but the Southwest, they had to scuttle that idea, and of course they went out to New Orleans International Airport, to MSY, and continued Lakefront Airport to this day, continues to be general aviation. Uh, it becomes a zoo like at Super Bowl time, or if there's any kind of big convention or such, where you've got general aviation, commercial, corporate, private aircraft, big companies in town like Entergy and other companies that operate private aircraft will use Lakefront Airport because the landing fees are less expensive and your proximity to downtown is a little bit better. So we're going to do a part two of the more modern Lakefront Airport, but this is a good start on some of the background and wraps up our discussion of the lakefront and the early development of the lakefront. Oh, word from your sponsor. Please buy my books. Yeah, the brothers book, which of course talks about my high school, Brother Martin High School. Go Satyrs. The My first book there in the middle about Canal Street and the Canal Streetcar Line. Go Celebrate Canal. My book on Maison Blanche, Mr. Bingle, is chapter 3. New Orleans Jazz is an overview, the origins of jazz, going into the West End brass bands, to Buddy Bolden, to the Creole Jazz Cats. That's a 1967 publicity photo of the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, which Pres Hall is a stop on my Friends of the Cabildo walking tour. Come check me out. And then, of course, Legendary Locals of New Orleans, which is a who's who of a whole bunch of people throughout the over 300-year history of the city. In 2017, I did a second book on Canal Street retail, which is Krause the New Orleans Value Store. So much fun digging into all of the stuff about Canal Street retail, Jewish retail, all of the different familial and political connections between the various families that ran businesses on Canal Street. Again, I am the NOLA History Guy, Ed Brandley, at NOLA History Guy on social media, Edward at NOLAHistoryGuy.com. If you want to email me, feel free to do so. I literally want to say, ask me anything in Reddit style about New Orleans, please. Not AMA, like anything in Reddit terms. That's a little bit much, but you get the idea. This wraps up our Lake Pontchartrain Lakefront podcast series. We'll be back with more stuff soon. Shout out to the folks who did this great PowerPoint template, this parchmenty thing that I just love using. Thanks much, y'all. We'll see you next time.